Good evening, everyone. My name is Adrienne Heron, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Christine Flame, and Winston Gamache from the Alberta Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge that the members of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab team are grateful to live, work, and play and be in relation with people from across many traditional territories here in Alberta. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to improving our relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and their knowledge. So with that, I'd like to introduce Winston. Winston joined the AWES with expertise in horticulture, agroecology, and agroforestry. He has a passion for all things gardening, especially perennial crops, fruit and fruit trees. He loves exploring the ways trees and human systems interact and planning resilient systems. With a background in biochemistry and biology, years of experience in horticulture, and perspectives from being raised on a farm, Winston helps to support our shelter built and agroforestry projects, as well as our extension work. So tonight, Winston's going to cover the basics and benefits of silvopasture practices with a focus on how tree and livestock integration can help with heat and drought on the landscape. And we're also going to cover planting, species selection, for cold climates, preparing for planting, and troubleshooting common issues with establishing new trees. We're wrapping up with potential funding pathways and available for these types of sustainable tree planting initiatives. So thank you very much, Winston, for joining us and our learners tonight. And the stage is yours. If anyone has any questions, please pop them down into the chat or into the Q&A, and we will answer them at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here and get this presentation going. Okay, yeah. Can we see that on the other end?
Yes. Okay.
Perfect. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction. As was said, we're speaking about drought and silvopasture and different practices within silvopasture that can help with mitigating drought and heat stress on your farming operations. A bit of a roadmap here today. We're going to start with just a general definition of agroforestry for those of you that aren't familiar, running into silvopasture specifically as an agroforestry practice. I'll go over a few case studies and just concepts on how this helps drought-proof the landscape or your operation. General planning tips on silvopasture systems and some things to avoid. And then, yeah, wrapping it up with funding pathways and questions. Yeah, like Adrienne said, the way this is structured is that we're going to dive deeper and deeper as we go. So hold your questions for the end, and then we can always loop back to a slide to dive a little bit deeper into it. So yeah, the Oz's mission in general is increasing awareness of the economic, social, and environmental values of agroforestry and woodlot. So in this situation, we're getting into that agroforestry topic a little more. We promote responsible woodlot and agroforestry management. We provide support and extension services to landholders, land stewards, and others who influence land use practices in Alberta. We work with a lot of counties kind of directly on their environmental programs. We were born out of the actual agroforestry and woodlot extension of the Alberta government. But when that shut down, there was a little bit of a turnover and we were reborn as this not-for-profit society. So kind of this halfway between industry and government and private land ownership as well. Yeah, so agroforestry in general, and officially, I guess, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations defines agroforestry as a land use system and technologies where woody perennials, so trees, shrubs, and vines, are deliberately used. That's really, really broad. I like to make it even more broad and just say trees for an intended benefit or purpose. If you've got an expected outcome or a goal you're trying to meet in mind when you're planting trees and woody plants, chances are it's agroforestry. So specifically silvopasture, a little bit of word math here is when we put the word trees, so that's the silvo part, and livestock together, pasture, rearing livestock, you get the word silvopasture. So it's quite literally trees and livestock on the pasture, on the landscape. Generally, it's rows of trees with livestock in between them, provides shade, provides wind shelter, allows for what's known as over yielding, which we'll dive for a little bit deeper into later. And it can provide fodder as well, which we'll go over. Forest grazing is similar to silvopasture, but yeah, forest grazing is more of like an existing forest management practice, trying to find balance between your herd and the forest. There's a lot less intention or intervention than a silvopasture system would have. So we're just focusing on silvopasture here today. So yeah, a couple photos here. Chances are people have seen landscapes like this across the prairies and in Alberta. On the left here, we have what would be considered silvopasture by subtraction, whether it was intentional or not. Trees were removed from this landscape by the farmer or by the cows, and you end up with more pasture in the end, but you still have this kind of balance of shade for the animals to be in and shelter. We also have on the right-hand side here, this is actually like a silvo-arable system, but this is a really good example of how you could set up like rotational paddocks in a large landscape. Imagine if you had some cows grazing in between here. This is what we would refer to as silvopasture by addition. We're taking empty land or empty pasture, I guess, without trees and adding in tree cover in a strategic way. We're going to focus a bit more on the silvopasture by addition today because it has some of the most notable and easiest to kind of quantify impacts on a drought and heat mitigation. Yeah, so again, silvopasture, trees, and livestock. That makes sense. So essentially, silvopasture systems are just multiple shelter belts in a row. So a lot of times I'll use the language interchangeably because we're talking about a shelter belt as a functional unit of a larger shelter belt system. So yeah, we got one shelter belt and some livestock, and that's lovely. That's silvopasture. You add another one, you get more benefits. You add another one, you get more benefits. It's basically a lot of times for ease of management and install, it is just a single row system that's copy pasted across the landscape. So there are different ways that trees and pasture interact. And like anything, there's both positive and negative interactions. So on my list of positive things here, we've got the benefits of nutrient assimilation, absorption cycling, making those nutrients more available for the other organisms in the system. We've got reducing ambient temperatures. We've got moderating drought and flood. We've got landscape hydration, specifically snow catch, very impactful for silvopasture systems. We've got nitrogen fixation potentially. We've got reducing wind erosion, and we've got, again, that concept of over-yielding, which we'll dive into. And on the negative side of things, we have things like encroachment. I know a lot of people who manage pasture are always battling things like, again, depends where you are in the province, I guess, but maybe cinquefoil, shrubby cinquefoil, or wolf willow is constantly encroaching on your pasture. Obviously, if you introduce woody plants to a pasture that has none, there's potential for encroachment in the future, but it's simple to manage if you plan for it. There's shading potentially. There is competition. There's nutrient competition. So when I say competition, that's for the actual physical space. A tree and a clump of grass can't occupy the same space. And then water usage or availability as well. But the idea is when you're thinking about how to best benefit your landscape, you're going to design a system where these positive impacts outweigh the negative impacts of the installation. And that's how we get our first sort of point of this concept of over yielding. So I got a nice little cartoon set up for you here. I kind of imagine it in like almost a video game type situation. If we've got this lovely, lovely cow. Maybe she has a calf, but just a cow in the picture. She's out in the elements. There's heat. There's maybe a lack of water. There's maybe intense winds, intermittent winds. This leads to slightly less than optimum condition on this animal. So we have a higher risk of mortality. We have lower fertility and lower offspring health. We have lower feed efficiency if you're battling the elements, whether you're trying to keep your temperature down or keep it up. That does burn calories. And then we have generally less feeding hours. This is one that gets kind of forgotten sometimes, but if an animal is having to if an animal's uncomfortable or running out of energy in the day, or if it's having to hide all the time from the elements, it spends less time munching on grass, which ultimately leads to less feed utilization. And then on the other side here, we have the concept of where over yielding comes into play. So this is the same animal, but we've given her some lovely mature shelter. She hasn't lost any condition on her little health bar there. And you have this opportunity for this synergy, right? You're gaining more benefit and the yield on the animal's health than you're losing in the value of forage where the trees and shrubs are taking up space. It's also a bonus that if you're planning this system for long-term diversification as well, there's potentially timber you can harvest. There is fodder. There's maybe a fruit or a fruit yield falling for the animal to eat. That's extra calories to offset the forage loss. Soil building, etc. That the list is really long and it's somewhat context dependent, but the idea with most agroforestry systems is even though you're losing a bit of space to the woody plants, the benefits outweigh the costs and you end up with a higher yield in the long run. Sometimes there's a transitional era, but yeah, in general, happier cow, comfier cow, better feed conversion. And honestly, even your alfalfa or whatever is growing between these rows of trees is also probably going to put on more biomass because it's not fighting the wind all the time too. So you get a bit of a trade-off, but eventually a better yield. So our first sort of case study, now that we're getting into the drought proofing aspect of silvopasture, is when we're thinking about the concept of snow catch. If you're tuning in from anywhere on the prairies, anywhere in Alberta, really even up into the boreal, we're technically what's called a subhumid climate, which basically means even on a good year, when we get our full amount of rainfall, we're losing more water during the growing season than we're ever gaining. That is really, really apparent these days. If you're getting a heat wave and it's almost like you're outside in a convection oven or somebody's blowing a hairdryer on you, these warm winds take a lot of moisture with them. Many really of the regions in Alberta specifically, and I think like holds true for Saskatchewan as well, they're relying on snowfall on a normal year for 40 to 60% of their annual precipitation. That's a lot, and that's a huge opportunity or a huge challenge. If you're not catching that snow, you're not able to keep the landscape hydrated, and water's kind of the magic ingredient when it comes to forage yields. Yeah, this is even higher on years when there's a summer drought. Usually our snowpack is still pretty reliable even in drought conditions. So if there's a summer drought coming and you don't catch any of your snow, you might be losing up to 80% of your annual precipitation in some regions these days. Yeah, so that just kind of highlights, I know they're kind of like a big range of numbers, but it does highlight that there's clearly a huge opportunity to support landscape hydration through snow catch. And hydration means better yields. Boom. There we go. So yeah, the case study specifically that I wanted to highlight for this snow catch concept, it was a study done out of Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan based. They took a few decades of real world data on a site that had all sorts of different shelter belt trials, and then real world data on all of the snowfall and all of the weather occurrences that happened there. And they built a computer model where they basically modeled out a half section of land. So you can kind of see in this top picture what that looks like. And they were comparing non-sheltered side to sheltered side in all of these situations. So they set up all these different virtual trials, essentially everywhere from dividing it into just two pieces with one shelter belt to I think the largest treatment included up to 11 shelter belts. But basically what this did was it was able to validate that real world data and predict that there is a trend between shelter and snow catch. I mean, it's one of those things that is kind of logical. You'd assume the snow is not blowing away if there's less wind. But they were able to show that in the higher range of impact, which I think I included this 8-row shelter belt because there wasn't really any higher returns after 5 to 8 rows across a half section of land when it comes to snow catch. But that was an extra half inch of moisture in the most sheltered situation. Across a half section of land, that is around 2,000 to 8,000 meters cubed of water. So that's equivalent on the higher end to an extra half inch of water alone just from the shelter in that scenario 11 pictured on the bottom one. There was another study from researchers on the U of S as well, Court et al. In 2011. They compared these landscapes on the prairies with and without shelter belts. So again, gathering a bunch of real world data. And they proved that snow catch was always increased up to 400 meters away from a mature shelter belt. So that's a lot of landscape impact. And that on average, a shelter belt had a 29% increase in snow catch overall. So you can imagine, like, as you move further away from the shelter belt, there's kind of this, like, the snow is going to be deeper and then get more shallow again up until it's not affecting anything at that 400-meter mark. But yeah, a 29% increase in snow catch, uh, that equates to around that 12.5 millimeter difference of snow. But when you put that across the whole landscape, that's a whole inch of rainfall on a half section of land if you're able to catch your snow. And if that has anything to do with spring crop health and things being able to root for the season, get going really well, that can make a huge difference. And then there's also the other extreme situation where we're talking about like regularly sheltered landscapes and then adding more trees to them and seeing these yield increases. But they didn't really study the opposite end of that spectrum, where like maybe it's an extremely exposed landscape or a very denuded landscape, the open prairie, um, where there's zero snow catch, and that just means they're missing half their water in a year. So any sort of shelter that can help with the snow catch leads to a better yield and a better hydration of the landscape, which is what we're looking for, especially in this drought state. So another aspect of drought proofing that is kind of interesting and that we don't really think about, it's not common cultural practice or agricultural practice for us to think of the actual nutritional value of the woody plants our animals might browse. As you can see, or anybody who's tried to do some forest grazing or grazing around brush, this cow is loving this poplar tree. And surprisingly, a lot of poplars can have comparable levels of protein at peak season to something like high quality alfalfa. So we tend to think of them as just weeds, but if you're integrating your system properly with the cows and the trees, you can have a measurable yield of calories from the tree fodder as well. This can be part of an annual harvest system annually in our context, where the trees are kind of grown more as large shrubs and they're coppiced to the ground every year. Um, you can harvest in like an emergency sense or during that summer dearth. Um, through summer on a 2 to 3 year rotation. We do have a short season, so the plants need a couple years to recover. But you can imagine a situation where you don't get that second cut hay and you have a bunch of head to keep alive and help them keep their condition until you reach the point in the year where you already plan to budget for other feed. Something like though that emergency tree fodder could really help save the operation on a dry year like that. You can direct feed, or some species can be dried as hay, and they actually hold all their nutritional value if they're bundled and dried as hay as well. They're very high in trace minerals that a lot of our shallow-rooted species, forage species, are not. And a lot of the kind of what I would call expensive trace minerals, sometimes we have to pay to supplement. So things like zinc, cobalt, selenium, huge for sheep. Huge for sheep. Could we have to supplement cobalt quite often, or else they're just not healthy at all. Lamb survival goes way down. And yeah, they're like I was saying, it's not common practice here, but there's documented tree fodder systems for many thousands of years in other regions of the world, and for us at least, um, hybrid poplar and willow seem to be some of the most promising things when you dive into the greater research. I didn't link any specific research here, but it does seem like those trials and those species perform the best in terms of establishment and nutrition yield. And there is some really interesting ongoing research on leaf silage and incorporating like whole chipped trees essentially into conventional silage operations. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to explore a bit more. Um, we tend to think of woody material as non-nutritional, but depending on how you manage a tree, um, there's a huge variance in the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in that material. Like you let a tree grow to like 8, 10 inches, you chip it. Yeah, it's mostly wood. It's going to be mostly carbon, mostly lignin, things that a cow can't really digest. But if it's in a coppice system, there's way more green material and sap compared to woody material. And you're getting a carbon to nitrogen ratio that's like many, many orders of magnitude higher. And that's the material that if you're ensiling it with other green material, you're going to get a lot of fairly low input nutrition out of that that could be used to maybe bulk things up if your corn silage isn't doing so well or something like that. And there's a lot of studies that prove some of, or they hint at that a lot of the compounds, the natural compounds, like things like salicylic acid, like aspirin related compounds, and things that are in species like willow and poplar, both contribute to animal welfare and also their feed efficiency in a way where it's like removing discomfort from, putting on 5 to 6 pounds a day. And that can help with like swine, especially. And also, I've seen studies that link to uh, the like a steer type situation where supplementing the tree fodder seems to have the effect of just making them more comfortable, which makes them better and happier, get better feed conversion. Our case study for tree fodder specifically, there's been a lot of silvopasture demonstrations in the prairie context, but there hasn't been this kind of next step where they've shown the true impacts of feeding that material directly to livestock. So I pulled one from McWilliam et al. Here. They are in, yeah, they were on in New Zealand. There's a lot of silvopasture and a lot of agroforestry research on in New Zealand. And lucky for us, some of the species use does overlap. So this is a study in New Zealand. I don't know if this picture was in New Zealand, but this is what I imagine sheep in New Zealand look like. They're nice and chubby and they're on nice grassy rolling hills. Um, this study was done during breeding season, specifically on a drought year. Um, so this is a situation where you're imagining you're losing the total amount of forage from the landscape, and you're also losing forage quality earlier in the season as those grasses start to dry down and go dormant. Yeah, so what they did was they weighed out and fed 1.5 kilograms of poplar per ewe per day throughout their pasture season, pasture breeding season, and they saw that this led to a 22% increase in lamb weight per ewe. So this didn't lead to noticeably heavier lambs. It did notice to slightly, it led to slightly more conditioned or better conditioned and heavier ewes. But this 22% increase in lamb weight per ewe, what that really points to is the fertility metric of the animal. So these ewes, like more ewes were having 2 or 3 lambs and raising them to a full equal weight. So in the end, there's a lot more profit margin there when this free material, minus a little bit of labor to harvest and drop it every day for them to eat, yeah, led to a 22% more marketable lamb weight. So that's pretty impressive. So they did note that it took them a few days to clean up and they got a little bit sick of it sometimes, but on average they were eating the 1.5 kilograms. The one thing that's really interesting about this is they were supplementing a hybrid cottonwood. And although the specific selection of hybrid cottonwood that was bred for New Zealand, where it's much warmer, doesn't grow here, there are a lot of similar genetics that share some of those parents. And I would imagine would have very, very similar results nutrition wise. So I think there's possibility there. You could use that same piece that was added to the landscape. In this situation, it was a big row of cottonwoods to help provide wind shelter in the pasture. And then on a drought year, all they were doing was lopping off branches. The trees were covered just fine. They were able to keep those animals out on pasture longer, and they proved higher fertility after their time on pasture because they were meeting their nutritional needs properly. So that was pretty neat. Another study, I believe also on of New Zealand, showed that supplementing tree fodder and providing them shade at the same time, feeding them in the shade of the tree they were feeding them, basically led to a 3% higher milk production in dairy cows. So this, if you look at a bunch of the other literature and kind of squint at it as a whole, that's under like normal conditions. There's some studies that report a 10 to 15% increase in milk production with access to shade and browse in the situation where there is an extreme heat event or a prolonged heat event where like that stress is compounding day to day to day. And anytime you're working in whole percentages, that starts to compound. So even a 3% increase in milk production, probably a quality production increase as well, that's going to affect your calf weight, that's going to affect your lamb weight. That's pretty neat to see. And then that 10 to 15% increase, or in some situations where the extreme heat event might actually dry out the milking cow, that's huge. So it's almost like an insurance policy in a way, providing some option for shade and allowing the animals to self-regulate quite a bit better. Yeah, and the direct link to heat and fertility is interesting. There's quite a bit of research that's showing like if you can keep an animal's body temperature more regular, which they like allow them to access the spaces to regulate much, there's a lot higher take rate when it comes to breeding animals, and that's it's kind of expensive if you end up with like a half your herd not getting bred properly or something like that. It might not be the ball's fault. It might be the internal temperature of the cows because they're roasting in the sun. So I think it's really interesting how the same trees that are providing both these benefits in it's exactly the same trees planted maybe for one benefit. There are additional benefits that we're maybe not properly utilizing on the prairies a lot. So, next time you're short on hay or something, maybe there's some trees nearby you can salvage or borrow for a couple years to meet your feeding needs. The next bit we have here is specifically talking about drought proofing when it comes to soil health. I do think something that gets a lot of attention when you're looking into topics like drought proofing. We're always talking about like, oh, soil carbon, soil carbon, soil carbon. But we're often assessing like only specifically like inert soil carbon. But there's a lot of aspects of soil health that having trees in the landscape and their benefits to that landscape lead to. There's increases in a bunch of different forms of soil carbon, and those ultimately allow the soil to act like a bit more of a sponge. So yeah, I think probably a lot of us have heard this idea that soil carbon is basically equivalent to water retention absorption. There's a lot of different metrics out there depending on your soil type, but you can hold extra many thousands of gallons on a hectare if you get that percentage climbing on your soil organic matter. So I found a study. This one was actually agroforestry systems on the prairies of Canada. And it was looking at this idea that not only are we getting more soil carbon on tree integrated landscapes, but we're also getting it in a more stable form. Basically in that smaller aggregate form, which is very, very bioactive. It absorbs and releases water very readily, and it's not likely to kind of be further degraded or digested. It's a more stable form, so that's an interesting impact. We're also seeing a higher total percentage of the carbon being cycled through microbial life, which are also they need water to live too. So if you have a higher microbial load and health in your soil, you're getting you got a whole little army of creatures, these little bacterias that are wanting to hold on to the water too and keep themselves alive, and that ultimately keeps your landscape more hydrated. And then there are more fungal mycorrhizae as well. Trees are usually very highly fungal associated, and those too, again, it's a creature that's going to hold on to water and kind of trade and barter with the other organisms in its environment. So yeah, this study's showing not only is the soil more stable and the carbon in it is more stable, you're getting the carbon in the microbial life, which counts for a lot, and same with the mycorrhizae, especially in a drought setting. Those creatures are going to want to stay alive, help you out here. So moving past the kind of more technical impacts of silvopasture on the landscape for drought, we also have just some general rules of thumb and kind of guidelines when you're thinking about planning and structuring your silvopasture. Again, this is a little bit self-explanatory, but it's a great place to start to think about when you're planning things. Ultimately, the shelter you achieve in the long run is related to the mature height of the tree. And in a silvopasture setting, if we're considering the tree fodder integration as well, that does mean the trees you coppice, they're not going to reach full height, and they're going to provide less distance of shelter. So yeah, you get your highest shelter right in the place closest to the trees and your shrubs in the silvopasture system. Then you get medium shelter, lower shelter. Um, there isn't a super easy way to like quantify that because it is different like based on your spacing or your tree species and all that. But imagine like there's kind of this balancing act between like, oh, I know this shelter belt's probably affecting good snow catch for 400 meters, but maybe at 200-meter spacing, I'm getting the best wind shelter for my animals. So it's kind of a balancing act trying to optimize all these potential benefits and avoid the situation where we've traded off too much land use and there's not actually enough grass to graze. So the components of a shelter belt, a whole is only ever as good as its parts. So it's important we choose some of the right species and the right species composition. I always think as a 3-row shelter belt as a minimum. You can get away with a 2-row in a system, but you're better off like crowding 3 rows than just only having 2 rows. And 1 row, I don't know if I consider that a shelter belt. You're not getting a lot of the benefits of the synergy between the components. So this basic minimum, this 3-row shelter belt, includes an evergreen row, a broadleaf row, and a shrub layer as well. A lot of times people forget the shrub layer. We'll go over why that is important. So yeah, starting with your broadleaf row. This is your medium-term shelter. They're kind of medium speed growers, but faster growing than your evergreens, which we'll talk about. Very, very important high wind sites. They have better high wind tolerance, especially if you're leaning into the hybrid poplars that are available. A lot of times in really exposed sites, even though we have a full suite of great native species to work with, they're just going to scrub on you and become very stunted in a very exposed landscape. But you include a row of that hybrid poplar, might not live forever, but it's going to allow those other species to establish and reach their full potential. So it's important to think about them as kind of like the workhorses of these systems. Your evergreen row, it's longer term shelter. I'm talking about like a spruce doesn't reach its peak until probably year 30, 40 plus, but it is going to live much longer than any of your broadleaf species. It's important for winter wind shelter, which helps both your animals and the other species in the shelter belt to establish. They can be faster growing, but they're not there's trade-offs there. Like I included this so that we could like touch on that idea of like a pine's gonna live way longer than a spruce, but it's probably gonna grow half as fast. So there's a bit of a trade-off between speed and longevity, and we always kind of want to plan for a bit of succession, like kind of put on our thinking cap and imagine what the species are gonna look like and what's gonna change, how the composition will change. And yeah, very, very important in high wind sites. The the really fast, northern winter winds are some of the most detrimental to your livestock. So, including the evergreens, especially on the northern side or where there's really, really high winds, they're going to perform as like kind of like filtering the wind in the long run and help keep that chill off the animals. And then your shrub layer, last but not least. This is really important because it provides earlier snow catch. Shrubs are much quicker to reach their mature height, and they are generally more quick to establish. So you might have a situation where like you did a bunch of dogwoods or lilacs, and they're twice as tall as your spruce trees are, and they're immediately sheltering those other longer lived tree species. And then they're really important and why I really want to highlight them, especially within the context of talking about drought proofing. They allow for like an on average deeper rooting in your system, and we can talk about that a little bit more in detail. So if you imagine a regular just tree only system, there isn't a lot of diversity in the morphology of what you're using here. A good analogy here is like if you've ever looked deeper into polycultures or mixed cover crops, the idea of them is that we're looking for a diversity of growth forms, both above and below soil to better use the space. And that friendly competition for them allows better partitioning of resources, including the soil access. So yeah, in this situation, we've got spruce and we've got a broadleaf tree. They're kind of just rooting as much as they need to. I always kind of say that trees are a bit lazy, and if you don't give them a reason to root deeper, they won't. And on this side, we've got more of a situation where we've added that shrub in. They're providing some friendly competition. A shrub only has the ability to root so deep, and it's going to take up that first meter or so of soil. And it's causing this situation where it's actually forcing the tree species to reach just a little bit deeper. And, we might only be talking about a foot or two, depending on the depth of your soil and like compaction in those lower soil layers. But like considering a 5-10 year drought might only fluctuate the water table a foot, having access to a foot more of groundwater can be the difference between surviving a drought and not surviving a drought. And as we're as we're seeing the most benefits from these systems as they mature, we don't want, a once in a century type drought to knock out this natural asset that we intentionally placed in the landscape. So adding in that shrubby stuff really, really helps with that. And you'll see as we go over potential layout structures in the next couple slides, ways that those shrubs can be integrated for sure. Yeah, so the other main component, oh yeah, so the one of the biggest mistakes I see is that we might be we might be making the decisions on the layout of our shelter belt based on aesthetics versus on the way it functions. So it's really, really important we create a ramp shape, and it's really, really important that we ensure porosity throughout the planting. So we want to avoid creating a wall. We want to create more of a filter for the wind to pass through. The wind is really, really, really strong. You can't actually stop it. You're only ever displacing it or moving it around. And if we create a wall, or if your density is too high, I think they usually say optimum is like 50 to 70% permeability. Um, you're you're taking all that moving air mass, you're bumping it up a little bit higher as it hits your shelter belt, and it's actually going to come down twice as fast somewhere else, probably inside your property or your unlucky neighbor's property. So again, yeah, we're trying to create baffles, filters rather than walls. And yeah, that's really important to remember. And in terms of the layout, we always want that ramp shape so that our species at maturity, or the way we manage our species through pruning, leads to this softer ramp shape, which again allows for the diffusion of the air rather than the like has to hit a wall, go up and over. We want to kind of be splitting the air a bunch of different ways, and it's basically like kind of like driving a wedge into it. So that's very important to consider. So for spacing and layout, one of the best ways to ensure you're creating these baffles and not walls is through either offsetting the trees, alternating your tree or plant structure and form, so alternating trees and shrubs, or just simply increasing the space either between rows or between the trees in the rows. So a few examples here. This is the 3-row system that includes like these little star-shaped guys are my evergreens, and the larger diamonds are a broadleaf tree of some sort, but all the little circles are shrubby species. So we actually just put a shrub between every single tree, and that creates a lot of variance and a lot of ways for the air to filter through. And it also allows for proper maturation and spacing on those evergreens. A common issue we do see with evergreens is, maybe we are in a rush to get shelter quicker, which is totally okay. But we put our spruce trees on like 6-foot centers. They'll survive probably if moisture is adequate, but you're going to end up with like all of these trees that mature into not quite what a mature spruce tree is meant to be. And if the above ground part is kind of stunted and crowned, so is the below ground part. So it's going to have issues accessing moisture. And you're also going to have this situation where maybe if they were all planted in a wet period, they look beautiful. But when it comes to a slight drought or a more severe drought, like some areas are in, there isn't enough water to go around to keep that many mature spruce alive. So you might lose the whole shelter belt because they're out competing each other for resources. It's totally okay to plant too dense, but you have to come back and thin later if they do all happen to survive. I never put evergreens closer than 4-meter centers in our designs these days, especially when we're considering the drought resilient aspect. But yeah, and then this layout would also have that single row of shrub on the edge that's providing that ramp shape. The this next little plan here, all circles, all different shrubby species. This is more of an eco buffer thing. Some of them might reach 3 or 4 meters tall, so they're still providing a decent bit of shelter. Um, and they are meant to kind of grow together over time, but just the way shrubs grow, they're kind of more open. And we're ensuring that our initial spacing does allow at least meter and a half centers across this grid. So that's another way to create this baffle shape where it's creating all these long pathways the wind has to snake through. Um, these really dense eco buffers also count on the fact that like maybe at a 20-30% loss we do end up with some entire like little tunnels and gaps through the planting, and that's exactly what you want this diversity of pathways for the wind to take across it, and that really helps diffuse the wind's force. And then our last kind of example is this is that 2 row shelter belt. We do this sometimes if space is extremely limited, but we're making sure we don't leave out the shrub element. We're putting a shrub between every spruce tree. And that's really, really important for that better rooting depth and that early snow catch, which, like we said, could be the make it or break it for keeping the project watered with very little effort. So yeah, always include your shrubs. Don't forget them. Could be Saskatoon, could be a dogwood. I don't know, could be cranberries, could be a lot of different things, but always include a shrubby species, add some diversity and resilience to the system. This next slide I have here is about kind of the most common 3 reasons we see for failure on a planting project and just general solutions that you need to consider as you're planning your project. So reason for failure, lack of moisture. In a drought, not a lot you can do about that. But you can design for drought or you can plan for intervention. So a solution to something like the lack of moisture, that magic ingredient, the water the plants need to establish some nice organic mulch. Even inorganic mulches can help keep the soil wetter for longer after a watering or rain event, or just plan for more irrigation. That might be something like a more passive irrigation, like it's a bit of earthworks to catch more rain or to easily flood irrigate it, or it might be more active irrigation, like ensuring there's some extra spigots on your cattle water so you can go out there with the hose and intervene in a drought setting. The first 3 years after planting are really, really key for adequate moisture and establishment. The amount needed does vary per species, but it's pretty hard to overwater in our drought state right now. You always see good payoffs. A couple years ago when the drought was starting in the central region, gave a bunch of clients exactly the same hybrid poplars from the same box, and the ones that went out there and watered once a month now have 15 feet tall trees, and the ones that didn't do that in the first year, barely have knee-height trees still. The trees are kind of stuck waiting for conditions to improve. So it's always I always joke, people ask me what the best fertilizer for the trees is, and it's water. Just get on there and get some more water on them. The second most common reason for failure we see is weed competition. This is a mix of competition for space and resources, and more, I guess the more problematic thing that weed competition causes is actually shading. Most of the species you'll be working with are not shade tolerant at all. They can only establish in open areas or edges of forests. So if you start getting like 3-4 foot tall Canada thistle or 6-7 foot tall sweet clover popping up, and it shades out those young seedlings, they will simply just die. No matter how much water they have, no matter how much fertilizer they have, they will just die from the shade. So you have to be able to, when you're thinking about how to set up this, you have to think, well, oh, how am I going to access it for mowing or weed whacking in the early years until they're above, grass competition. Might be a spraying plan. If your operation already includes the use of agrochemicals, why not use one of the ones registered for use in a shelter belt to control all of your weed competition? Or again, like mulch is a bit of a magic answer here. You could fix your moisture problem and a lot of your competition with mulching. I know some regions don't have a lot of access to maybe mill waste or arborist wood chips, but if you can source something like that, it works. In a drought setting, like even, some rotten hay or straw could be a really good way to go. We do want to be careful about creating rodent habitat with mulch, but usually those bales that nothing wants to eat and they're already moldy and kind of falling apart already, sometimes that'll buy you a couple years of weed suppression, and that's all the trees need. And our third reason for failure that's most common is kind of a result of not, going out and digging some test holes in the first place. You need to understand what the soil compaction is like on your land. If it's well managed pasture that hasn't been compacted by trampling or overgrazing, you're probably fine. If it was ever annual cropland, you need to watch for that hard pan that can exist at certain tillage depths. Um, and or if it's just more of like these gumbo type heavy soils, gray wooded soils tend to become very gumbo-y when we take the trees off of them. um those are just heavy, and you need to give the tree a bit of a chance to be able to root deeply, and you also need a way for water to permeate a little bit better so that it can work its magic. Like simple, I say, solutions to a lot of logistics, but things like tillage or ripping lines with a subsoil plow. That's one of my favorite minimal disturbance type planting preps. You're breaking up all the vertical compaction, horizontal compaction in your soil with a vertical cut, and also allowing an easy place to plant the tree. Um, Post hole augers, like a 6, 8, I don't know, even 10-inch auger if you've got a skid steer or a tractor with an auger implement. And you're doing this kind of high intensity prep system for your shelter belt and silvopasture. Auger hole makes a nice little microsite, removes the turf, keeps the competition back for a bit, makes it easier to weed whack around the trees without hitting them, makes it easier for watering because when you put water down, there's a bit of a bowl there. Unless you're already in a really low area, it's okay to prep like an auger hole and allow for some settling and the tree to exist in a bit of a ditch. Our trees are way more able to adapt to that being planted a bit below grade and having access to moisture than they are, frying in the wind or just running out of moisture. And yeah, like I said, those subsoil plows, with or without the kind of mold that follows behind them and opens a tunnel, those rippers are really nice for improving infiltration of water on the land and tree success, as well as relieving compaction without maybe the same disturbance that tillage introduces. Pretty much all the land in Alberta I've seen, you till and you wait, and it's just Canada thistle everywhere, or a whole number of other nasty noxious weeds. And those are not great because we don't want them growing and adding to the seed bank, but we also don't want them providing all that competition to our new trees. So if you can go for a minimal disturbance route, that's usually what we recommend these days. Yeah, that's kind of like my main red flags there when establishing a planting for silvopasture for shelter belts. I think we're rounding up on, yeah, so the funding pathways that we offer through Oz and that are available out there these days. Um, in the news a little bit these last couple of weeks, the 2 billion tree program. Good news is we already had our contract, we already have the money, and we will be distributing it through 2030. So we're committed to planting another 287,000 trees in 2025, which we did. And I think we're aiming for 500,000 next year. As our program scales, we provide everything from site assessment, planting design, planting services, and monitoring and reporting. And that's all covered under this program. It's very flexible. It's a tricky program to describe sometimes because as long as we can sign off on the fact that, the trees will be kind of untouched for 20-25 years, and that you're not going to double sell any of the carbon credits associated with those stems for 25 years. Has nothing to do with soil carbon, has nothing to do with natural recruitment or anything else to do with your actual land base. Not tied to the title. It's just specifically those stems. Yeah, we can fund it. So we've done everything from working with municipalities to plant golf course greens, adding in trees, essentially creating, silvopasture systems for luxury for humans on golf courses, to something like fire guard restoration, larger silvopasture plantings. It's very, very flexible. So if you have a project that you think might qualify, definitely reach out. It is a grant matching program, so or a fund matching grant rather. So the way that breaks down is it's 25% cash or cash equivalent. We'll loop back to that in a second. 25% in kind, so like labor, planting, your time planning, all of that stuff. And then it's 50% match with that Oz/2v2 funding we have. There is a 500 stem minimum. The thing that's really interesting with this program, I find when I'm working with producers, is like we can probably often find associated costs you were spending anyways that do genuinely benefit the health and like survival rate of these trees. So say you're setting up a silvopasture system, you're already paying for your fence, or maybe you got Alice funding to pay for your fence. We can match all that funding and time spent on the fence with the trees for the project. So that's a really nice way to do it. Or you're putting in more waters for your cows out in pasture. Make sure there's a spigot on a few of them, and we can count that as an irrigation upgrade to help with drought alleviation. Or maybe you're I don't know, maybe you already have a big stockpile of wood chips sort of thing. We can count those at a market value amount that you're contributing to the success of this project and, provide some of the labor and the trees to get this done, as well as the expertise you might need. Yeah, that 500 stem minimum, as long as it's there, we're good to go. We do also offer through Oz, we operate as a society to serve our members. So if you buy a yearly membership, you're eligible to buy stock at cost that year. So we offer all of our extra trees and shrubs just sold at cost, which is highly subsidized by our greater operation. Usually our costs per stem are about a tenth of the next kind of available retail option. So yeah, even if you're not sure you might qualify for this, we can't figure out a way to get it in there and you're dead set on planting some trees, we can at least get you connected with some really high quality, somewhat, indirectly subsidized trees as well. So yeah, and like I said, I had mentioned Alice, definitely check in with your counties or if they have an Alice Pack committee in your county. A lot of them have different goals to green the landscape or make it more sustainable, especially in relation to um, livestock and landscape interactions. And yeah, I haven't met an Alice community that hasn't, loved the idea of a diverse silvopasture system and how it can help things and riparian buffers, that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely look out and even if you're not sure, like part of what we do at Oz is helping you connect with um avenues like that to help realize your projects. So just reach out. We'll see if we can help you with accessing some specific funding. We do have some specific industry tied and kind of more private funders that have really specific goals. They'd be like, oh, I really want to fund like saving a fish bearing stream for a sheep farmer or something like that, right? Just as an odd example. But so like just reach out. We'll see what we can match you with there. Um, I'll pause on this one for a few seconds so you can pause the recording later if you want, but these are a bunch of the references, some of the knowledge I was drawing on here from the greater works. There is a lot of research out there, fairly recent research too, on things like silvopasture and trees impacts on the prairie. So yeah, don't be afraid to dive in and look some of this deeper. If you have any specific questions about any of these papers I referenced, I'd be happy to discuss them in the question period or at a later time. Yeah, questions. We have our mailing list and newsletter sign up here as well at Oz. I'm Winston Gamache. You can most easily reach me for intake at the info@ozalberta.ca one, and then we do have our general Oz phone line here. You can leave a message at, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. But yeah, I think we'll open the floor for questions and see where we go from there.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Very
Thank you.
good learning tonight. We do have some questions. Just a reminder to everyone who's with us, if you have questions, pop them in the webinar chat or into the Q&A and we'll answer them. The first question, Chelsea, would like to know what orientation was the most beneficial, north, south, east, or west?
Oh,
Practicing
I mean that is
practicing.
context specific. So there is, I would say 9 times out of 10, your prevailing winds in Alberta at least are north, northwest, west. So typically we want to be protecting that west and north border. Um, but in terms of like a silvopasture system we're talking about where there's repeating rows anyways, it doesn't actually really matter which way they're repeating in because they're going to provide some sort of crosswind protection. If you Google like Alberta windrows generator, our government has a wonderful little site where you just pick a weather station near you and it'll actually show you the data of like what your major winds are with kind of no bias of, oh, I only go outside on sunny days and that's the way the wind blows sort of thing. And that's one of the things we do walk through when we're planning these systems is we'll pull real world data to make sure we're blocking the winds that actually exist. Yeah.
Awesome. Trevor would like to know, Would leaving retention strips of native forest cover provide the same benefits as planted shelter belts in terms of things like optimizing snow catch, etc., with the
Hmm.
added benefit of higher shrub and tree diversity, coming with the perspective of being in the Peace Country where clearing land is still quite common? It would
Hmm.
be neat to see better planning from the outset rather than clearing areas entirely.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where that kind of silvopasture by subtraction comes in. We are removing trees from the landscape, but we're specifically strategically leaving some. The one thing I would say is that our native forest is often too dense to provide that filter effect. So long-term management may actually include thinning of that native stand to get your best both like wind dissolving property and your snow deposition property. So it might be a little bit more thinning. I've seen systems like that that are really lovely, and I've also seen where people will brush the whole thing, leave the brush windrows as early shelter, and allow the native forest to, like all our clonal aspen and poplar and stuff, it'll just regen through those brush piles and build like a lot of carbon heavy soil at the same time. There's a lot in the Entwistle area actually where somebody around there, I don't know whose idea it was, but somebody started leaving their brush piles intentionally for shelter, and those are really beautiful pasture systems now. So yeah, you can also do something like that. I actually went to a a little field trip. I think it might have been one of the Living Labs field days in one of the regions. It was in Westlock County, and it was lovely. But I was cringing a little bit because a hybrid poplar plantation had been thinned. Um, and then all of the regrowth was terminated, and you could have left strips and then had really really high silvopasture benefits with almost no turnaround time because those root systems were still intact, but after you chemically terminate them, they're kind of toast. And I think that landholder was looking for just more open area, but I was like, oh, that would have been such a cool like example of how we can like minimal effort establish a silvopasture. So yeah, always think about what you can strategically leave, I think. Yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Paige would like to know if honey locust trees grow in our growing zones.
They're they're one I'm playing with a little bit. From what I've seen is once you take them out of the city microclimates, there's some beautiful like seed-bearing honey locust specimens in Edmonton proper. But once you take them out of the microclimate of the city, the best thing I've ever seen is they're like a shrub that dies to the snow line every year. That doesn't mean they have no value in the agroforestry system, but you're not likely to ever see them fruit because there is no older wood. But they would still be building biomass, filling that shrub niche, and fixing a bunch of nitrogen. With the caveat that if you get a year with minus 25 and no snow cover, they're probably just completely dead. I've been starting to plant a few thousand seedlings every year, and I'm hoping just one ends up hardy enough to grow in zone 2, 3. But yeah, there's something you see mentioned in a lot of agroforestry literature, like in not much milder climates, but slightly milder through tropical climates. So, but I think if you're looking for an analog for something like a honey locust in our climate, native nitrogen fixers like silver buffalo berry or green alder are probably a better bet, or river alders. There's a lot of non-leguminous nitrogen fixtures we have as well.
Awesome. Jonathan says you mentioned protein content for trees being eaten by livestock. Do you have
Hmm.
numbers for trembling aspen?
Hmm. A lot of what I was looking at, because I'm a little bit obsessed with them, is the hybrid poplar species. And they top out at around like 20% digestible available protein, with lower tannin value. I think some of the stuff I've seen for Aspen is it's probably more around 10, 11%, which is still great. But in terms of digestibility, a lot of our native species, they have high tannin content, which gets worse throughout the season, so they lose digestibility and actual available protein. Except for in cattle. For some reason, cattle to almost an extreme point, tannins do increase digestibility, so you probably wouldn't have that loss in cattle. But something like a sheep or a goat, actually, the more tannin value, they lose efficiency. I could probably dig some up specifically on aspen because I know they grow like weeds in most regions. It would be easy to work on a kind of a rotational coppice system with your native aspen. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yolanda, I understand that trees and shrubs cannot be harvested for at least 25 years. Do you have suggestions of trees and shrubs that someone can plant that they could benefit from commercially?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it depends on one of the tricky things with like smaller scale timber um things right now is it's kind of like a cart and horse situation is we don't have a supply of high quality kind of bespoke small lot timber. So we don't have a market for it and vice versa. So but that being said, I do think like I've seen beautiful furniture made out of like box alder, Manitoba maple, tree form choke cherries, green ash make lovely hardwood for like craft pieces as well. I imagine we could mimic other areas of the world like the UK where everything is, coppiced regularly and we have a pole wood economy. Like a dimensional 3-inch pole is just as strong as a 2x4 and actually meets international building code for standards. So if we had a pole wood economy or if somebody was growing pole wood, right? It could be marketable, at least on a sort of local scale. There is also a lot more people with small mills opening up, like hobby mills. So I've seen a lot of people, selling select spruces and pine onto their landscape for big architectural beams or furniture boards and such. I would lean heavy probably into like lodgepole is a high value timber like throughout the future, and then polewood would be more those hybrid treeform willows, non-native willows, and probably hybrid poplars as well. I think if you're planting the trees anyway, there's no risk in planning a bit for that, but it's going to take a collective effort in the future once those products are ready to actually build a culture around them here, I suppose. Yeah.
That makes sense, Winston. Jonathan had a follow-up comment. When you said hybrid poplars, do you mean Okanese poplars or something else?
Okanese is lovely. It's like a golden standard for hybrid poplars these days. It's a very complex hybrid. It borrows all sorts of adaptability and disease resistance from all its parents. But there's a whole suite of them. Like there's maybe 10 or 12 in regular cultivation, but there's literally thousands of them. The thing they all share is that they have at least two very different sets of genetics. So they have that hybrid vigor, just like any of your hybrid seed crops would. So they're way more adaptable and they're likely to grow optimally in a changing climate or in changing conditions. So yeah, Okanese is a great one to lean into. It's a little extra tasty for like browse pressure, so sometimes like you got to consider something like that. But it also is extra tasty for a fodder crop too, because it's it's
Yeah,
it's uh,
I
it's
think
less bitter. Yeah.
he was referring, he had asked the question about if you had any nutritional information on the.
Oh yeah, Okini's that is the one some of the ones that show up as like actually named in the papers having nutritional value. I'm hoping again it is very context specific. So like I'm hoping as I gain some more specimens in my collection of the hybrid poplars, I can actually like send some leaf tissue for analysis. There's a pig nutrition lab at the U of A that's maybe interested and they'd be able to break it down for me. Because obviously, there's going to be a moisture level, soil type interaction there too. But in general, those hybrid poplars they're making the most of what they have, and that does translate to plant health, which is, protein value and nutrition. So
That makes perfect sense. And then just more of a comment from Frank. He says the benefits of using grazing forest for wildfire suppression with removing the understory. And along those lines, if anyone's interested, Frank included, we're hosting Too Close to Home Fighting Fires While Feeding Cows on January 21st next year.
awesome. Yeah.
Please make
Yeah.
sure
So yeah, those
to register.
those oh sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Vincent. That's
Okay.
it.
Yeah, those forest grazing practices, yeah, if you're managing your brush and your kind of quicker fuel load or any of the ladder wood, if your cows are helping to remove branch and like raise the low branch height, that can help a forest go from, a complete immolation, all the trees are dead to just it burns through the grass layer and also like running things through forest periodically. It looks like a mess right after that, but it also helps recycle a lot of the nutrients built up in the dead grass, especially in these drought cycles. And like the kind of bottom line is, as long as you're not overdoing it, all of our native species evolved with high kind of versus disturbance, I guess. Like the disturbance is a friend for them, whether it's fire, tornado, or a herd of buffalo. They're our native species. They come back stronger and cleaner, more disease free when they are intermittently disturbed like that. So yeah, don't be afraid to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then we have time for one more question from Chelsea. What species would you recommend for low-lying areas, wet areas, other than willows to manage a wet area, give soil stability?
Hmm. So other than willow species, we usually lean into in wet areas are like some shrubby stuff like dogwoods, currants, high bush cranberry, alder. Green alder is very moisture adapted. You do have to distinguish between wet and like peat mossy environment versus wet and clay. Because chances are like a heavy wet soil, probably your native willows are the only thing that's going to live it there. But if it's more of like an organic based wet soil, that supports a larger diversity. So yeah, tamarack as well. I guess we throw into low-lying areas quite a bit. Or if you're not sure if it's going to stay wet forever, Siberian larch is their cousin that can handle both wet and dry. Sometimes we hedge our bets there. So yeah.
Nice. Winston, thank you so much for spending an hour of your time. Your passion and knowledge really shines through in this subject. And if anyone has any more questions for Winston, his email and telephone numbers there, you could scan that QR code, or you could reach out to us and we'll connect you with Winston. And with that, thank you very much, Winston, and thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for having us. Hopefully, we can collaborate again in the future sometimes.
We'd like that. Thanks. Have a great
Thanks,
night.
thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.